Tucson visit. Welcome, Dr. Jordan, and thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you so very much, Gene, for that introduction. Thanks to John for his comments, and thanks to all of you for being here today. I can't think of a better way to celebrate Abraham Lincoln's 212th birthday than to get together with all of you and talk about some of his common foot soldiers. I grew up in Northeast Ohio, and I was a member of no fewer than 4 Civil War roundtables. So they really nourished my interest in this most pivotal period in our nation's history. And I really appreciate and relish actually the opportunity to speak to roundtables whenever I can. So indeed, I'll echo Gene's comments that I hope as soon as we are on the other side of this pandemic that I'll be able to be with you there in person. I'm particularly excited about this talk today because it's the very first opportunity that I've had to deliver a talk about my brand new book, A Thousand May Fall, Life, Death, and Survival in the Union Army. As Gene mentioned, it was just published January 26th out with Live Right W.W. Norton. And I have copies of that available as well as my earlier book, Marching Home. So you have the information about how to reach out to me about obtaining a personalized autographed copy. I'd be happy to do that for you. From their position on the campus of the Adams County Almshouse, a trio of buildings that sat in a neat row along Gettysburg's northern edge, the men of the 107th Ohio Volunteer Infantry Regiment surveyed the wide, flat plain that extended before them between the Carlisle Road and the Harrisburg Pike. To the west, a sequence of sturdy ridges creased the ground, and an unfinished railroad trace gashed into the earth, supplying the Union soldiers deployed there with a measure of protection. But out north of town, north of Gettysburg, there was no cover, no shelter, no refuge to be found. As the Ohioans looked to their front in this warm July afternoon, they spied only the slight earthen knob that locals had come to call Blocker's Knoll. War makes a rather peculiar habit of promoting to sudden significance otherwise unremarkable ripples in the ground. And in that respect, this day would be no different. Atop that forlorn rise, a precocious division commander, a 28-year-old Harvard valedictorian named Frank Barlow, would unlimber 4 Napoleon guns, shake out a skirmish line, and plant a tiny Union brigade, stretching the thin blue ribbon of Union troops that coiled around Gettysburg just about as far as it would stretch. Before long, shot and shell winged overhead, the first portent of enemy soldiers massing for a major assault. After what must have seemed like a lifetime, the men of the 107th Ohio held back in a reserve position, looking on toward Blocker's Knoll, were finally nodded forward to lend their strength to these beleaguered Union troops in Leopold von Gilsa's brigade. They advanced out to that knoll with heavy steps and knotted throats, some inserting one last cheekful of tobacco. To be sure, such a daunting errand might have given any such troops pause, but it was a distinct dread that flooded these Ohioans. For almost exactly 2 months before, at the Battle of Chancellorsville, these men had been among the first troops crushed under the weight of Stonewall Jackson's flank attack, that daring maneuver that had delivered some 26,000 Confederates to a Federal flank that derelict commanders had left dangling dangerously in the air. In mere minutes at Chancellorsville, Jackson's howling rebels had added more than half of the 107th Ohio to the Civil War's ever-lengthening register of killed, wounded, missing, and captured men. Now, on this first July afternoon of the war's 3rd summer, once more deployed on the extreme right flank of a threadbare Union line, it seemed as though the past was repeating itself, and with a vengeance. For the soldiers of the 107th Ohio Volunteer Infantry Regiment, the meaning of the Civil War inhered in such misfortunes. Though many Union soldiers, as my colleague, the historian Leslie Gordon, has pointed out, ached for an unambiguous story of their wartime service, free of anything embarrassing, unmanly, or dishonorable. Men of the 107th Ohio came to understand their participation in the Civil War by tallying and indeed taking pride in the enormous suffering, losses, and sacrifices that they experienced both on and off the battlefield. The men of the 107th Ohio were especially anxious to demonstrate to a deeply politically divided citizenry back home that they could battle no less manfully than their native-born comrades in arms. Because harvested in the late summer of 1862 from a dozen northeastern Ohio counties, the 107th was an ethnically German regiment. More than 70% of its personnel was foreign-born, numbering it among just 30 Union regiments that boasted a true majority of immigrant soldiers. And to be sure, more than 200,000 ethnically German immigrants fought in Uncle Sam's armies between 1861 and 1865. The vast majority of these German troops fought in otherwise native-born outfits or in units that comprised about a third or a half of their strength from immigrant soldiers. Very rare were the true ethnic regiments. So the 107th Ohio was one of them. Their language, their identity, and their popular perceptions of their loyalties set them apart, even as, of course, these men weathered the numbing human ordeal of the Civil War in ordinary ways. They were, I argue in this new book, men betwixt and between, men who belonged but did not. They whipsawed between hope and heartbreak, between duty and dereliction, between cynicism and conviction. With little fanfare, they shivered in squalls of snow at Brooks Station in Virginia and flagged under the fevers of Folly Island in South Carolina. They swatted at gluttonous mosquitoes in camp and navigated treacherous roads on the march. They battled treasonous rebels at the front and exchanged taunts with contemptuous civilians back home. They knew the taste of victory, but more often than not, they felt the ache of defeat. When they returned north, finally, at the end of the war, they tended to the onerous errands of memory and to the agonies of the many chronically sick, wounded, and disabled men among them. Toggling then between the war's extremes, the men of the 107th Ohio helped to complicate our understanding of who Billy Yank really was. Recent historians have rendered two very different portraits, I submit to you, of the Union common soldier. According to one body of scholars, Billy Yank was steel-jawed, sure-footed, and self-restrained, motivated by patriotism and a keen sense of what was at stake in the conflict. The escalating demands of the war paid him remarkably little trouble. If anything, his experiences under fire and in close proximity to the material culture of slavery only magnified his convictions, his determination to keep moving on. These histories from the pens of Belle Irvin Wiley and James McPherson and Earl Hess have magnified Billy Yank's courage, pluck, and determination. Still another body of scholarship has foregrounded the Union soldiers' anguish, misery, and woe. And these noticeably darker accounts from historians like Gerald Linderman and Michael C.C. Adams, the natural, physical, and psychological deprivations of war exhaust the youthful idealism that first propelled Billy Yank into the ranks. On countless blood-stained battlefields, he confronts the stark divide between the glittering war that he imagined in 1861 and the horrific one that he fought in 1864 and beyond. Now, both views, both bodies of scholarship have revealed some important truths about Civil War soldiers and their service. Yet, I will argue, they have equally effaced, I think, the war's lived complexities, the extent to which the war was at once a tale of pride and pain, of courage and cowardice, of life and death, loyalty and betrayal. This is then precisely what the men of the 107th Ohio help us restore to view: the murk and muck of life in camp and on the march, the demands of carrying on, standing guard, simply putting one foot in front of the other, the satisfaction of having suffered, sacrificed, and somehow survived. Today, I want to give you a flavor of their story, and in doing so, suggest something of the human topography of the American Civil War. Now, in the summer of 1862, Ohio's Governor David Todd authorized the creation of the 5th ethnically German regiment from the state of Ohio. There would be 6 in total during the course of the Civil War. The German Citizens Military Committee canvassed the state's northeastern counties for eager recruits. Among the 994 men who volunteered were stonecutters and shoemakers, butchers and blacksmiths, tailors and tinsmiths, carpenters and clockmakers, porters and peddlers, millers and masons, weavers and watchmakers. They came from every rank of life, and they tallied many different reasons for marching off to war. Reports that the regiment would reinforce Franz Sigel, the revolutionary emigre turned Union general, acted like a charm and aroused many soldiers to march off with much enthusiasm. Some yearned to follow in the martial footsteps of revered ancestors who had fought in the American Revolution or the War of 1812. For still others, pecuniary inducements appealed more powerfully than patriotism. The 107th's ranks included both Republicans and Democrats, those who were anti-slavery and those who thought about the Civil War primarily as a war to preserve the American Republic, to preserve the Union. The regiment first snapped to attention at Camp Cleveland, a bustling training complex situated on some 30 acres immediately south of that city. The 107th Ohio, though, trained for no more than 3 weeks. And much of that time they trained without weapons. Even once the men were equipped with their much delayed rifled muskets, they found these Austrian manufactured muzzle-loading weapons woefully inconsistent. Yet these deficiencies did not prevent the regiment from receiving, on September the 21st, 1862, 4 days after Antietam, orders to proceed at once to Covington, Kentucky, the bustling collection of saw, iron, and steel mills on the Ohio River that anchored the makeshift defense of Cincinnati. For much of the summer, as you may recall, the Queen City had been bracing for a rumored rebel invasion. That much feared threat, of course, did not materialize, but the fears of Cincinnatians would not be so easily allayed until the defensive work shielding the city were amply stocked with blue-coated soldiers. And so Governor Todd nodded forward his new German regiment to fill those earthen works. The 107th Ohio, despite their lack of training, despite many of them not knowing how to load or fire their weapons in 9 times, they were eager to experience battle, their baptism of fire. But there would be much marching and, of course, no fighting in Kentucky. Still, the regiment's first march in Kentucky proved a most memorable episode. At first, things moved forward, accompanied by song, explained 21-year-old regimental musician John Brunny. Before long, temperatures rose, haversacks grew heavy, and muscles became sore. Clouds of dust choked the air, and thirst set in. These factors, according to one soldier, increased the weakness of the soldiers' human powers to such an extent that after only 3 miles, dozens of men looked to desert. Cursing officers struggled to keep the men in the ranks as they lost courage and collapsed along the side of the road. Not a few among them, Brunny recalled, attempted in vain to quench their thirst by scooping up water from dirty puddles. The march exposed the stark gap between their expectations and experiences. Further, when it was revealed that they had spent the day marching in circles and that their destination could have been reached in 1 hour, the march prompted the unit to question openly both the perspicacity of their leaders and the absurdities of the war. Not having found the enemy in Kentucky, a dread of inadequacy and a deep sense of self-consciousness began to afflict the regiment. They were impatient for action and they yearned for an opportunity to prove their martial mettle. Yet even a welcome transfer to the seat of the war's Eastern Theater in Virginia in the late autumn of 1862 did not occasion an appointment with battle. For a porridge like muck plastered Virginia's roads and arrested the regiment's forward progress north of Fredericksburg. With all the marching that we've done, we haven't done anything toward ending this war, one frustrated footsore soldier lamented. Moored in place, the men of the 107th Ohio instead settled in for a long winter north of the Rappahannock River. Shivering in snow and ice as waves of dysentery and diarrhea and typhoid made their deadly romps through the ranks, the winter encampment of 1862 to 1863 proved a most formative experience for the regiment. Operational historians have long recognized that the months the Army of the Potomac spent moored on the Rappahannock amounted to a strategic pause, a prized period for troops to rest, restore, resupply, and regroup forces. But less fully appreciated, I think, is the extent to which that winter encampment really did invite sustained and valuable reflection among enlisted men. It's about their participation in the war and the peace movement, which at that very moment was then rapidly gaining adherents on the northern home front. Indeed, the winter encampment of 1862 to 1863, what some scholars have called the Army of the Potomac's Valley Forge, neatly coincided with the ascendancy of the anti-war Copperhead Democrats, whose leading exponent was from Ohio, the Ohio Congressman Clement Laird Vallandigham. He delivered an anti-war, anti-abolition tirade on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives the very day that the 107th Ohio trudged into its new camp at a place called Brooks Station. Throughout the North, many Republicans decried this democratic defeatism. But nowhere did the opposition to Copperheadism blaze with more righteous fury and indignation than in this new camp of the 107th Ohio. In their winter huts, the men penned letters and ratified resolutions expressing their desire to see the war prosecuted fully toward a vigorous conclusion. If they don't want us to come down here and fight, one of the unit's enlisted men recommended, or let them keep their mouths shut and not disturb us. I will leave my bones to bleach on any battlefield in the sunny South, he retorted, before I will say compromise or before I will say enough. The objections of the Copperheads seemed to matter not. All I ask, another of the Buckeyes insisted, is for those who know nothing of the war and its ravages to hold their mouths and not discourage those who are risking their lives in an effort to restore a tottering government to its former position. Idealizing then their shivering, suffering, and sacrifices, men of the 107th Ohio invited openly a contrast between their martial masculinity and the unmanly agitation of the stay-at-homes. Some of the men even expressed a desire, if the occasion presented itself, to engage the Copperheads back home in open combat. In an intrepid editorial, one private proposed to send some of our weather-beaten soldiers home, armed with a gun and a bayonet and 60 rounds of cartridges. Christian von Gunden, who shouldered a rifle in Company I of the 107th Ohio, agreed indeed to forego a much-anticipated furlough, if and when issued orders to go home and confront the Copperheads. Halfway business is about played out, Christian Schreiner explained. It would indeed be a deplorable thing if civil war should break out in the North. But if it cannot be avoided in any other way than by yielding to the Copperheads and the Mudsill rebels, I say let it come. Scholars have rightfully lauded the administrative, dietary, and hygienic reforms championed by the Army of the Potomac's new commander, Major General Joseph E. Hooker, their role in reviving the morale of Union regiments on the eve of the Chancellorsville campaign. But again, no less significant, I think, were these months of restless immobility spent in camp, clarifying exactly what was at stake in the war. Anti-war opposition on the northern home front indeed promoted an ironic unity among the rank and file. These Democratic traitors cannot humbug me with their talk about habeas corpus and false imprisonments. Their mourning about the Negroes, Christian von Gunden attested. The more the Copperheads rave, another 107th soldier echoed, the more determined the men in our army get. That renewed strength and unity would be sharply tested, however, when the Army of the Potomac finally broke camp and stole through the tangled timber of a second-growth Virginia forest called the Wilderness, and at last engaged Robert E. Lee's troops at Chancellorsville in May of 1863. For its part, the 107th Ohio shook out into a line of battle at the Tally Farm along the Orange Plank Road, anchoring the extreme right of the Union Army, holding the extreme right of that federal flank that dangled dangerously in the air. Throughout the morning of May the 2nd, reports about an ominous buildup of Confederate soldiers were proliferated Oliver Otis Howard's 11th Corps headquarters. They were repeatedly waved away by Howard and his division commanders. Instead, as dusk approached, the general apprehension that had for hours rippled through the regiment finally began to subside. Then came disaster. The only omen of Stonewall Jackson's flank attack was that lone artillery shell that came hurtling into the ranks about 5 p.m. 20 minutes later, with the crushing power of an avalanche, the metaphor used by one of the 107th soldiers, Confederate brigades neatly arrayed on both sides of the Orange Turnpike, Robert Rhodes's oversized division in the lead, tore into the unsuspecting Federal flank. Hearing the wild shrieks and demonic yells of the whiskey-baited rebels, it seemed to one first lieutenant in Company D as though the population of the lower regions had been turned loose to devour our men on the spot. The initial shock of the bewildering attack quickly yielded to chaos as Union troops scrambled pell-mell for the rear. The Ohioans scampered into their second line of field entrenchments. According to the 107th Jacob Smith, the battle now assumed the character and the appearance of a massacre. The bullets, Christian Riker from Zor, Ohio, marveled, just whistled by my head like a real hailstorm. The men squeezed their triggers and stood as long as a stand could be made, they assured, before falling back in a chaotic retreat. If we'd remained just 5 minutes longer, insisted one soldier from Connecticut who was brigaded with the 107th, we should have all been killed or taken prisoner. As it was, the losses in the regiment's baptism of fire were staggering. The rebels had killed, wounded, or bagged as Richmond-bound prisoners some 220 of their men. It was 52% casualties. No less vexing than the physical injuries were the psychological consequences of Chancellorsville. Almost immediately after the battle, Godfrey Capel of Company I began to manifest symptoms of what he called nervous fever, an ailment that soon became an epidemic within the regiment. Godfrey's unaware of what is happening, Christian Riker reported in late May. Often he wants to leave, and when one asks him to where, he says to his home in Zor. Only weeks after the battle, Sergeant Charles Weimar was reduced to the ranks, being incapacitated by insanity. Citing his feeble state of health and the perilous condition of his company, and the recent trials and hardships to which the regiment had been subjected in the late battles of Chancellorsville, First Lieutenant Hamilton Starkweather resigned his commission. More than a few men were unable to sustain their enlistment idealism. If we're asked to what was gained by our brave loss of men, the regimental musician John Rodell insisted plainly. The plain answer is no gain at all. Though the collapse of the 11th Corps line at Chancellorsville in no way preordained the Federal Army's crushing defeat in the battle, Northern newspapers effortlessly seized upon the stampede, their word, its ethnically German outfits, as the devastating battle's decisive moment. Oh, they cleverly effaced the failure of native-born leadership that had provoked the crisis at Chancellorsville in the first place. Far easier was it to stereotype and stigmatize German regiments. Threats, entreaties, and orders of commanders were of no avail that day, the Daily National Intelligencer seethed from Washington, D.C. Thousands of these cowards threw down their guns and soon streamed down the road toward headquarters. The New Hampshire Sentinel echoed that the Germans fled past General Hooker's headquarters in a panic. Many of the members of Hooker's staff with their pistols and sabers, vainly endeavoring to stay them and to keep up the fight. For weeks, the false-hearted allegations multiplied, allegations embroidered with an ugly nativism. They annexed Northern newspaper columns. Northern newspapers, one perceptive observer commented, were all too anxious to lay the blame for the defeat at Chancellorsville at the door of some despised foreigners. Ironically enough, then, only months after indicting the Copperheads back home for their own cowardly misdeeds, the 107th Ohio found itself in the surreal place of responding to allegations of cowardly conduct leveled at their own. In responding to these charges, the men further organized their ideas about service and loyalty, clarifying the nature of their commitment to the Federal war effort. I saw a letter yesterday from home, Lieutenant John Winkler reported, stating a report that our company left the battlefield and had run at the appearance of the rebels without firing a shot. In a tart epistle that he addressed to his hometown newspaper, the Worcester Republican, the Wayne County soldier explained that it was his duty to inform our friends back home of the facts. We went forth to do battle for the Union and the Constitution, he wrote. We want to be decently used and not abused. In sharply worded missives, they cataloged the battle's human destruction and wielded their lengthy casualty registers as evidence of their brief yet hopeless stand. The memory of the noble men gone to their graves and now languishing in hospitals, one correspondent from the 107th added, is entitled to a plain and unvarnished statement of fact. For the ethnic soldiers of the 11th Corps, indeed, the struggle to establish what had happened along the Orange Turnpike would be nearly as trying as the battle itself. In this fight, however, they would enlist the support of the larger German-American community across the North. From Manhattan to Cleveland, mass meetings assembled to rebuke the calumniators and to hurl these slanders back into the teeth of their fabricators. At the Cooper Institute in New York, Frederick Kopp, an ethnically German refugee who had penned several stirring accounts of Hessian contributions to the American Revolution, leveraged his authority as a historian to denounce the defamation of the 11th Corps as dangerous to the Union cause. I never knew a soldier, he explained, who was willing to fight the enemy in the front when his comrades or the people for whom he fights back at home stand ready to stab him in the back. 2 months later then, perched atop Blocker's Knoll at Gettysburg, the 107th Ohio looked for a measure of redemption as they braced for the Howling Georgians splashing across Rock Creek. They were flooded, no doubt, with chilling memories of Chancellorsville. Frantically, the men gnawed the paper from their cartridges, but in little more than the space of an hour, history repeated itself. The Confederates had easily enveloped the Union position out there on Blocker's Knoll and prompted the Federals to scamper frenziedly through the borough of Gettysburg's knotted streets in retreat. Rather than redemption, the regiment's poor deployment at Gettysburg yielded another 211 casualties. 50% of the 50% that had survived Chancellorsville would now count themselves on those registers. In a move that seemingly confirmed the pejorative assessments of ethnic soldiers bandied about in the press and in the army brass. Army headquarters abolished the 11th Corps, and in August 1863, right after Gettysburg, whisked 107th Ohio to the war's margins. The 107th Ohio would pass its last 21 months marking time in South Carolina and Florida. Moored in exotic camps far from home, subjected to mindless drill and numbing fatigue duties. Or they betrayed dejection and gloom in their letters and diaries as they continued to try to work through the horror of Chancellorsville and Gettysburg. We looked every hour upon the same naked beaches of sand, one enlisted man explained. We looked on at the same drooping palmettos, unable to escape the thought that they had been consigned to irrelevance. The troops no longer shined their shoes, folded their gum blankets, or polished their muskets. They snubbed military conventions that now seemed but empty, ridiculous ceremony. Deprived of the opportunity to participate in headline-seizing battles, they instead chronicled with great fidelity their campaigns against sand fleas and scorpions, wood ticks and mosquitoes. In this way, they could continue to suffer and indeed bleed on behalf of the Union cause. Indeed, the 107th Ohio would have only one more opportunity to confront the Confederates in battle. A sprite fight alongside the men of the famous 54th Massachusetts Regiment, a place called Dingle's Mill, South Carolina, on Sunday, April the 9th, 1865. The Ohioans acquitted themselves in that battle very well. So well, in fact, that a young private named Henry Finkenbinner earned for himself the Medal of Honor for his daring rescue of 2 wounded comrades caught between the enemy lines on a burning bridge. Of course, as luck would have it, their heroics at Dingle's Mill in South Carolina would be eclipsed on that very day by the news emanating from Virginia. The very moment they squeezed their triggers along Turkey Creek, Robert E. Lee had, of course, accepted his fate and was waiting for Ulysses S. Grant to meet him in Wilmer McLean's front parlor at Appomattox. After chasing the rebels through the heart of the Palmetto State after Dingle's Mill in an unjustly overlooked operation called Potter's Raid, the 107th Ohio spent the last weeks of their wartime service occupying shell-pocked Charleston. There they passed the 4th of July in 1865 and 6 days later received their coveted discharge papers, having packed a lifetime into 2 years and 10 months. But the peace that followed would be as complicated as the war itself, inviting penury, renewed prejudice, and protracted battles, both with the Pension Bureau and with a host of ailments: chronic diarrhea, fevers, chills, gangrene, consumption, constipation, dysentery, liver trouble, deafness, blindness, shortness of breath, nervousness, insanity, and alcoholism. Just a few of the ailments tallied in this unit's pension files. Ugly wounds prevented Frank Rothermel from opening his mouth more than 1/3 of an inch for the rest of his life. Theobald Hasman from raising his hands above his head. Peter Schreib from extending his arm. A shell wound not only deafened Lanson McKinney, but left his face badly disfigured. Together, these men bore witness to the war's violence. Their furrowed brows and unsteadied gaits supplied compelling testimony about all that they had seen and experienced. The war was something indelibly inscribed on their bodies, something they were never able again in their lifetimes to escape. To the very end, the men of the 107th Ohio believed that their many months of suffering had granted them a singular authority over the war and its meaning. During the conflict itself, they asserted that authority by resisting numbing fatigue duties and registering their distaste for discipline. As veterans, they drew on that authority to demand new and more capacious definitions of duty, sacrifice, and patriotism. Much more than headline battles and extraordinary deeds, they seemed to insist, were required for Union victory. Instead, everyday metal of the sort put on display in disease-choked camps and in overcrowded hospital wards had made possible the resolution of the Civil War. Empty sleeves were honorable scars, but so too, they maintained, were frostbitten toes and crooked fingers, raspy coughs, and labored breaths. They wanted the nation to never forget their protracted marches, their time on remote picket lines, the times when they impatiently marked time and suffocated from self-doubt. Now, they're convinced that they had climbed to the snowy heights of honor once described in elegy by Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., or entirely ready to concede that the war had been some irredeemable folly. Men of the regiment instead fused pain and pride into a single interpretation of the war. Loss and anguish were, even for the most sentimental and nostalgic among the regiment's veterans, fundamental to the conflict's meaning. Celebrations of the war always implied a reckoning with its costs. As one scholar recently observed, the veterans revisited the terror of the conflict that had marked their service long after the war, if only to take greater satisfaction in the comforts of a hard-won peace. The sacrifices, they believed, bespoke their loyalty. Or the legacy and question of emancipation divided the men in peace as it had divided them during the war, none of them could deny that they had stood by the flag in the face of a treasonous rebellion. The nation, however, in the late 19th century preferred to move on. And so it was that in the twilight of the 19th century, poet Walt Whitman could declare that in the fervid atmosphere and typical events of the war, they were in danger of being totally forgotten. Not a few of the regiment's veterans sensed their unique war had not gotten into the books. In 1906, Martin Boyer appealed directly to the editor of the nation's leading newspaper for Union veterans. Please publish a short history of the 107th Ohio, he implored. I'm a reader of the National Tribune, but I've never seen anything in the paper concerning the 107th. The intuition that the regiment's unique experiences had not been adequately recorded similarly inspired Jacob Smith, an ambulance wagon driver, to put pen to paper on a unit history in 1910. He hoped, tellingly, that something of the toils, dangers, labor, and hardships endured by ordinary soldiers in the Civil War might finally, at long last, make its way into print. I've never in thought or in word, regretted what little I had done for my country in the way of duty, Smith concluded at the end of his now long forgotten book. I've always been proud that I'd taken some humble part in the great strife. Confident but self-conscious, acknowledging the yawning void between the war he waged and the war the nation preferred to remember, the old soldier in many ways had penned a fitting epitaph for his regiment. Our histories today are rarely peopled with the likes of the men of the 107th Ohio. I suggest to you that until we reckon with how and by whom our nation was saved, our understanding of the Civil War will remain impoverished. Thank you so very much for your kind attention. And now I hope we can engage in a good colloquy and dialogue, and I'm happy to entertain your questions.
Well, Dr. Jordan, that was wonderful. I'm going to just kick off with a question, and I just want to remind everybody that you can go into the chat, which is at the bottom of your screen. Just click on that little icon, and you can put your questions and comments in there. So I'm just going to kick off as people are doing that. I'm interested in your interest in this. Are you of German descent? Did you have family or maybe friends of the family that participated in the 107th?
That's a great question. So I do hail from Northeast Ohio and from one of the counties that fielded troops for the regiment. I did not have any ancestors who participated in the unit, though I am very proud of 11 Buckeyes in blue who are in my family tree, none in the 107th. I stumbled upon them. I was asked a few years ago to contribute an essay to an anthology on cowardice at Gettysburg. And I encountered the very doleful tale of the regiment's colonel, Seraphim Meyer. who was the only colonel court-martialed for cowardice at the Battle of Gettysburg. And so I was asked to write this essay about Meyer, and I dug into Meyer's story and the regiment's story. And of course, so many of the place names were familiar to me, towns and communities that I knew intimately growing up. And I thought this would be one piece, one chapter, one kind of confined project. And these men just kept calling back out with just their compelling story and with how little had been written about them and all of the various angles of the Civil War, from ethnic participation to notions of cowardice to veterans issues. And so I thought, well, I'll turn this into a series of articles. And before long, I realized that I had a book right before me. Interestingly enough, as I was working on the project, I discovered that a high school friend actually had a great-grandfather in the unit. So I do have connections, and I do know folks who did have ancestors in this unit. Still to this day, and I think this is one of the points that comes out perhaps more strongly in the book than it came out in the presentation today. Sense of the regimental community is very strong. And we know, of course, that regiments were the building blocks of Civil War armies. But I think as scholars, we haven't yet appreciated the extent to which that community of the regiment lived on after the war in very real ways. And these men continued to live in the same communities, to look in after one another, to support one another emotionally, financially. And that community still exists today in the form of descendants. The descendants still know one another and communicate with one another. And I've heard from several descendants of the 107th just in the early days now of this book. And they're still very much plugged into their ancestor stories and still very much keep that regimental memory community alive. So it's a book that took me back to Ohio and was a nice excuse to get back home for research and then to be able to write about places and
continue a story that's sort of unique.
Yes. Yeah.
We do have several questions here. This is from one of our members who's always quite knowledgeable. This is from Steve. He said, your accounts of suspicion and prejudice of German-born federal soldiers was interesting, compelling, and also very sad. He asked, are you familiar with the, and I'm going to mispronounce this, Courier der Union episode in Central Texas in late summer 1862, where German-born loyalists to the federal government were attempting to flee Texas when they were attacked by Confederate forces and essentially slaughtered?
It's Troja der Union. Troja der Union.
Yes, indeed. And again, unionism in Texas, especially in North Texas and these German communities in Central Texas related to this episode, is not widely known in the popular Civil War community, and it should be. Out in Comfort, Texas, there's a monument to this massacre of German Unionists. It's only about 2.5 hours from where I am sitting today. So I'm very much aware of that, and it that whole episode for the German Unionists in Texas deserves to be much more broadly known. Of course, the monument is out here, but it's certainly something that's deserving of
maybe another book. I see another book in the future.
Yeah.
Another from Janet Wally, who's a visitor with us today. Wonderful and stirring presentation. You really brought the 107th to life.
Oh, thank you so much.
From John Fierno. Did the German soldiers have a common opinion of General Sigel? Any extraordinary loyalty to him?
They certainly did have an unusual sense of loyalty to Sigel, given his Civil War record. A lot of that's because, of course, and this is not universal among German soldiers, of course, but there is the sense that the American Civil War is a continuation of the democratic revolutions of 1848. And of course, Sigel becomes one of the icons, right, of those failed democratic revolutions of 1848. And this is a continuation of that struggle. They see it as a global struggle between freedom and liberty against tyranny and slavery. And Siegel becomes just, despite his dismal record, someone who commands their loyalty. And certainly, if you look at the enlistment motivations for the 107th, they cite the notion they're going to go off and fight with Siegel as one of the great inducements to go off and enlist. So he had a powerful appeal.
That's really interesting. Another question from Don Wegeman. You noted the attitudes of the regiment with regard to Copperheadism in the winter of 62-63. Did you notice any shifts of attitude about abolitionism across the years of the regiment's service?
It is a great question, and their attitudes do shift quite dramatically over time. Their attitudes about the war shift pretty dramatically over time as they realize the extent of the conflict, right? And often it's tied to and tethered to the landscapes of the war. When they march into Washington, D.C., and then toward Fredericksburg in the fall of 1862, they see that, the Northern Virginia has been deforested, it's been turned into an armed camp, and they realize for the first time just the real stubborn extent of the rebellion, which has existed in, kind of the imaginary until this point. And they come to embrace a real understanding of just what it will take to suppress the rebellion, that this isn't something that's going to be easily put away. And there comes to be a commitment, especially as the Copperheads rave about abolition, as they rave about Lincoln and emancipation. They kind of come to embrace emancipation almost despite the Copperheads, right? It's not necessarily a sense of humanitarian sympathy for the plight of slaves, or it's not necessarily that they have had an awakening in terms of racial equality. But they'll come to embrace emancipation because the Copperheads are against it and the Copperheads are against them. So therefore, I'm going to be for emancipation. By 1864, though, they're so frustrated with the war effort, and they're so frustrated by a perceived betrayal within the army from Northerners back home. They're looking for any way out of the war that actually in 1864, there's vigorous debate within the regiment about the best direction forward. Should we vote to re-elect Abraham Lincoln, or should we embrace George McClellan, who of course had a more limited view of the war and was fighting a war primarily for the Union and didn't want to see this become an abolition war and abolition peace. And the 107th actually is a very narrow majority, but they're actually the only Ohio regiment that gives a majority of its votes to George McClellan in 1864, the presidential election of 1864. So attitudes about slavery and race, and this is one problem, right? When with Civil War monographs more broadly, we often, we love sweeping conclusions and sweeping generalizations where we can talk about all soldiers felt this way, all soldiers felt that way. Yeah. One advantage of this project, getting onto the ground with one regiment, shifting our angle of vision, right, is that you understand that things ebb and flow and change over time, and that it matters where you are and when you are in the war, and having that kind of finely grained, nuanced perspective from the ranks of the regiment and seeing how these debates roiled one particular regiment. It gives you a sense of how that was replicated in the Union Army more broadly across all 3,500 Union regiments.
That's really great. Well, Dr. Jordan, you've done just a marvelous job of explaining this all to us. I want to mention to everyone that you can check the chat. I put into the chat his address so that you can order both of his books. The title I wrote right down here. The Thousand.
Do we have time for a couple more questions by any chance?
Oh yeah, if you have another question, Bob.
Yeah, I do. A couple things. Actually, Don Walgeman kind of asked the question I initially had about the attitudes. Was there any desertion in the 107th Ohio or, throughout the rest of the Union Army? That's one of the questions that I had.
There are a number of instances of desertion. Some in there's a wave of it in October of 1862. So kind of right immediately after this disillusioning experience in Kentucky, There are court-martial records that document sort of a wave in October of 1862. And then it becomes a real problem once they're transferred down to the Department of the South in South Carolina and Florida. They feel that they have been disrespected, that they've been confined and consigned to irrelevance. And so desertion does become a pretty significant issue for them. One of the great challenges of this project is that the 107th regimental records in the National Archives are notoriously incomplete. They were actually, in December of 1863, the auditors who would go through from the Quartermaster General's Department to evaluate the record keeping in all of the regiments, they actually wrote up the 107th Ohio for how poorly they maintain their records, which of course makes our work a lot more difficult. But certainly there are a lot of cases that we have, and probably many more that were not documented.
One more quick question. You mentioned Fighting Joe Hooker, and I've read and heard that the term hooker for a prostitute comes from him, but I've also heard that question that isn't true. What's the facts?
So that term is actually used in that sense prior to the war. We do have instances of it being used prior to hooker, although the name fits, right? Hooker certainly had a bawdy reputation, and there's a lot of skepticism as a result. 107th in particular expressed a lot of skepticism when Hooker comes in to replace Burnside as commander of the Army of the Potomac. A lot of that skepticism, of course, immediately goes away because of the really important hygienic reforms and other dietary considerations, rotating furloughs that Hooker puts in that really trying winter encampment in early 1863. But he was kind of a lewd guy, to be sure.
But it didn't originate with him.
Didn't originate with him.
Okay.
Elise, I have a question for the professor, and it's not related directly to the excellent presentation, but we don't, in fact, I've never had a professor giving us a talk, so it relates to the question of whether what he sees as the future for Civil War studies in the academy. Are the students coming in now to the university interested in Civil War history or history in general?
I'm happy to report that, at least from my perspective here at Sam Houston State University and what I know from my colleagues in academia more broadly, this is really a wonderful moment for Civil War history. Our work, our field has never been more productive. I mean, you look at the scholarship that's coming out today, it's a lot of my colleagues in the Department of History here kind of, scratch their heads and they look at the subject of the Civil War, and more than 60,000 books have been written, and they say, what possibly new can you say about this topic? And every year, right, we kind of defy them by approaching the conflict from an increasingly broad variety of angles. We're amplifying voices that have long been neglected: immigrant soldiers, African Americans, women, unionists. So it's a really dynamic moment for the field of Civil War history. Our own history department here, I became the chair of the history department in the middle of the pandemic, which I wouldn't recommend to anybody. But we now have over 500 undergraduate history majors, more than 110 graduate students, all of them eager, all of them thoughtful, ready to look to the past as a way of contextualizing our own current moment and thinking carefully about the value of history, and in that history teaches us humility and empathy and how to critically think and to think about change over time. And I'm really excited about where we are today. And I think the field as a whole has never been healthier. So military history of the Civil War certainly is not as prominent in the field and certainly within the academy as it once was. I mean, Civil War history was once, if you were writing a dissertation in Civil War history, it was pick your battle or pick your general, right? Write your battle study or write your biography. And all of that's good. I mean, I love military history. I love military biography. I think the campaigns and the battles are really important. But I think it's also important that we're able to situate those things in a broader social, political, economic, cultural context. And I think that's been the work of this up and coming generation of Civil War scholars. And our understanding of the battles. I tell my students we do a traveling course every other summer where I'll spend 18 days on the road, and I'll lead them through 10-hour days going through all the Eastern campaigns. And I tell them you can't understand what happens in the battles if you're looking exclusively at the maps. You've got to understand, right? You can't understand what Grant does at Cold Harbor on June the 3rd unless you understand the political pressure that he's up against, unless you understand the larger context of that particular moment. So that's what we're doing now in Civil War history. And I think if anything good has come out of this pandemic, it's things like this, right? That we can get these groups together, and we've seen historians innovate and reach broader audiences with digital tools. So I'm excited and feel pretty good about my profession.
Thank you.
I have a question for Professor Jordan.
Yeah.
You mentioned when the 107th was basically parked in South Carolina, they had, the desertion problem exacerbated. But even then, they were kind of still deep in rebel territory. Where's a deserter going to go? Were they just taken to the hills and taking their chances? It just seemed a little weird for me. If you're deep in enemy territory, where the hell are you going to desert to?
Yeah. So they're when they're in South Carolina, they're on Folly Island, and they're kind of in occupied Charleston. And so a lot of it is just kind of absenting themselves, taking a French leave, finding a way to leave the lines. Discipline becomes a huge issue in Florida, right? They're down along the Florida coast in Jacksonville, a place called Fort Clinch. And then, so there are opportunities that way. I mean, desertion is not, again, it ebbs and flows as with everything else in their history. And certainly there are probably many more cases that I mentioned that we haven't documented, but they're in those Union occupied areas where things are a little bit different.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank Professor Jordan for joining us today, and very excellent and informative talk. And we want to keep our invitation open for you to visit us in person sometime in the hopefully not too distant future and get to see Tucson up front and personal.
I hope to do so really soon and get out there to visited Picacho Peak in 2003, but I need a return visit. So I look forward to it, hopefully soon.
Thank you. Okay, we'll just turn it over for a few minutes to a general discussion of our organizational meeting. Professor, you're welcome to stay, or if not, you can feel free to go about your business. So I would just like to mention a couple things. One, I hope you noticed that we've got a new website up and running, a revised website, which really looks very good and professional. So if you haven't been there, go ahead and click on it and look into it. It's in development still, but it's, in my opinion, a great step forward. And then, so the next meeting is in March, and Cindy Laughlin will be our presenter in March. Does anybody else have anything they want to say for the general good of the order? Any comments or questions on what we're doing here?
The only thing, oops, I was just going to add in the chat, be sure and look at the mailing address in case you've lost the email that I sent. That's the information where you can obtain one of the books. Of course, Dr. Jordan received no fee or anything for speaking to us. So that's always a great way to express our appreciation is to buy his book.
I was just going to add to the website story. If you haven't looked at it, it's great. And I think visually it's just really impressive. And the Picacho Peak graphic is a wonderful tie back to what little Civil War history we have in this area. So I thought it was well done. Is well done.
Okay. Okay, well, I appreciate everybody attending, and look forward to seeing you next month. I guess we're going to have a little board meeting. If the board members are here, could stay on for a minute. Maybe want to talk, otherwise.